Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. This is rather a special opportunity for me. The last time I was here for one of these lectures was to introduce Ian Smith, who was the chair of the Four Seasons Healthcare, which is one of the largest private healthcare trusts in the UK. And they specifically sort of specialise in dementia care, and their Oyster service has won many awards. And so the focus of that work was very much on the training of nurses and the support given in that sense. And tonight we have a very different approach, one which I would say is complementary, and which is about the way that technology is harnessed and used to provide a different sort of support, but in exactly the same area. We have two guests this evening, and before I introduce Bill, I'm actually going to welcome Dr. Ardis Hansen, who I just said hello to, who's been over at our library talking to David Clay earlier on this afternoon, who is the Director for Reference and Education at the Schimberg Health Science Library of the University of South Florida. So welcome, Ardis, and I'm absolutely delighted you're here. And I would say that you couldn't have arrived at a better time. We've got archives coming out of our ears that we don't know what to do with. We've got the Working Class Movement Library, we've got a world-class library just there, and we've got music archives, and we've got Salford Museum, and we're just working out how through a digital humanities lab we might be able to pull all those resources together and really make a world-class research facility out of them. So a conversation with you, with David, I know will be interesting, and will feedback and hopefully continue the conversation another time. So welcome, and thank you very much for coming up. I'd like to, of course, welcome and introduce Bill, Associate Professor William Kearns, who is a research professor in rehabilitation and mental health counselling at the University of South Florida, a College of Behavioural and Community Sciences. Bill has just been to Nice to the annual conference of the International Society for Gerontechnology, and indeed he was until recently president of the North American chapter of that society. He's also the associate editor for the Journal for Gerontechnology. I say until recently because he announced today that he's just been made president of the overall society. So congratulations to you, and fantastic. And I think that reflects the quality and depth of work that you've been involved in for a long career, and a very productive one. And also you've just come up from Cambridge, where you've been talking to, as part of their science hub, the producers of Ubisense, which again is the application of sensory devices to health issues. And I think part of the interest of this is that so many of the great advances in science, of course, actually comes from dubious backgrounds. Often it's from war and the need for technology to get a competitive fighting edge, and indeed it's from the military that some of these sensors that Bill has been working on has developed that sort of the tracking devices, and again from being able to identify inventories and aspects of inventories in a container ship full of different types of military hardware, through then to its application for BMW and Airbus, then through into wandering syndrome, that wonderful name, and tortuosity paths. This is all a mouthful for me, I have to say, but just fantastic the way that you can track actually that movement from human use of war machinery into something which is to the good of the community, and there's a deep philosophical edge to that one which we aren't able to deal with tonight, although in a conversation we had earlier on we did begin to get onto some of the ethical issues and some of the polarizing sort of approaches that we've got in what are essentially interdisciplinary teams. I think it was to just finish the military sort of analogy and the link. Bill's actually done a lot of work with TBI, which is traumatic brain injury, with vets coming out of presumably Iraq and other war zones, and it was the monitoring of those and being able to predict through the fractal analysis that you've been doing to be able to actually predict the likelihood of them having an injury through falling from daily patterns of usage. Really fascinating stuff. So that's enough of me trying to make head and sense of a subject which I'm absolutely not an expert, and I'm very delighted to introduce you and to welcome you to take the platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Walker. It's a great privilege to be here this evening and addressing you and your auspicious faculty. As I mentioned, I'm from the University of South Florida. One of the things that's not up here on the screen, which I would like to add, is that I'm also a member of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, and that will become, the reason for that will be evident in just a few moments. I would like to say also a word of thanks to our associates at the James A. Haley Veterans Administration Hospital in Tampa, who have made a lot of this research possible. So I'm going to start by asking you to consider the following. How are the following related? A 1707 British naval disaster of epic proportions, this extraordinary machine, a devastating neurological disorder, global positioning systems, and veterans with traumatic brain injuries. So on the night of October 27, 1707, Sir Cloudesley Shovel was having a bad night, one might say. He miscalculated his course and ran 3 capital ships of the realm into the Scilly Islands, and this led to the death of 2,000 Marines. This also, of course, outraged Parliament in a way that I can't even imagine today, but it was a colossal humiliation for the realm, and led to the creation of the Parliament's Longitude Act, for which a prize of £20,000 sterling was offered to anyone who can solve the problem of longitude. Now, latitude, of course, is relatively easy to assess from the position of the height of the sun above the horizon. However, longitude was another matter altogether. The actual calculation of longitude requires some fixed position on Earth as a reference point to start with. And the number of different alternatives that there were that were put forward to try to do this feat were truly phenomenal, some of them involving bleeding dogs, just every crackpot idea you could possibly imagine. The Royal Astronomical Society actually had a very good approach to this, which was to look at the moons of Jupiter. Only thing it required was an absolutely still platform at sea and cloudless nights so that you could calculate this. And then it took about an hour or two in order to do the calculations from tables in order to figure out where you were. However, John Harrison, who was a clockmaker with an obsession for accuracy, took a somewhat different route. This is a picture of John Harrison, who's our idol at the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, I will say, from Barrow upon Humber. He actually is placed 39 out of 100 in a BBC poll of 2002 of the greatest Britons. Pretty good feat for a guy who invented a very accurate clock. His actual grandfather clocks were accurate to about 1 second a month, to give you some idea. So he got some rather incredible precision in the 1700s, so state of the art. This particular device on the left is his first ocean-going timekeeper, also called Harrison 1 or H1. It's a series of pendulums that have counterweights on them, which are relatively immune to the tossing and turning of a ship being pitched hither and yon at sea. One of the things that he didn't account for were some of the torsional aspects and forces on this which introduced errors. He tried to refine this through another 3 iterations, and then was, at some point, was shown actually a watch, one of the early pocket watches that were being produced at the time, and he kind of dropped his entire line of invention and when it moved away from a pendulum-style device to a balance wheel-type device. And what he ultimately came up with was the device on the far right, which was H4, which then became what we consider today the ship's chronometer of the time. Highly accurate device. Of course, for those of you who know quite a bit about navigation, you need no real explanation about this, but of course, by winning the longitude prize and being able to accurately calculate longitude, the British Empire was then able to go and really branch out worldwide and take advantage of what at that time were very perilous routes by being able to successfully navigate around shoals and avoid pirates, etc. But in this case, just to give you an explanation, Greenwich, of course, is your 0 point by virtue of the fact that longitude from this point forward was measured all according to the British standard as it still is. So for every about 15 degrees, you can see as we step around the globe, you have a time offset, if you will, relative to Greenwich. And by knowing the time offset at your local time by measuring the height of the sun at noon, you can then reference what the exact time is at your location versus that of a clock which is kept on Greenwich time. And from that you deduce where your longitude is. So knowing both those things allowed you to figure out where you were on the face of the planet. So in this case, time was pivotal to you actually knowing where you were on the surface of the planet. So this is one of my favorite devices. Let's see, and it looks like I may or may not be able to show it to you. Let me see if I can. Ah, there you go. There we go.
Hello, I'm John Taylor, and this is the Corpus Clock. It's just struck 3. We're in the workshop just outside Cambridge where it's being built. And I'd like to show you something about it. So, where are the hands? I wanted to create a new and a different way of showing time. This is not a computer generation, but a true mechanical clock. The face of the clock depicts time as a wave coming out from the center of the universe. Every second runs round the dial, a pulse of light showing time racing away. To me, time passes slowly or more quickly depending on the circumstances. Time is relative. And as Einstein said, an hour sitting with a pretty girl passes like a minute, but a minute sitting on a hot stove seems like an hour. I wanted my clock to catch the observer's attention and to make them think. Its heritage stretches back nearly 300 years to John Harrison and his invention of the grasshopper escapement. For the Corpus Clock, I've enhanced the image of the grasshopper into a chronophage who munches a minute every 60 seconds. This escape wheel is 50 times larger than Harrison's original, but it works in the same way. It is controlled mechanically by the pallets, which are the legs of the chronophage. The time is displayed by a series of vernier slits and lenses, hours, minutes and seconds. The time is 11 o'clock precisely. The vernier slits allow the passage of light from a bank of LEDs that are always illuminated. And incidentally, the whole bank only uses 60 watts. On the inside of the escape wheel is the disc of slits for the seconds. The escape wheel is driven by the clock spring through these gears. This carries forward the drive for the minutes disc, and then the hours disc. I would be delighted if you would accept my invitation to come to the inauguration of the Corpus Clock and celebrate the release of the chronophage and relative time onto the unsuspecting citizens of Cambridge.
So what you just saw was, if you will, an elaboration of Harrison's original work, but a truly remarkable accomplishment. That clock actually was dedicated by Stephen Hawking, and as I remember, I think it had a price tag on it of around about 10 million pounds. It was really quite a device. So Harrison's work with accurate timing, of course, led to the creation of ever more precise time bases, which led ultimately to the creation of GPS. Now, prior to 1978, all navigation was done with ship's chronometers of the type that you saw previously. Devices that were very precise, but you didn't have your satellites at high altitudes in order to provide you with precise triangulation as you do today, which can be used obviously in your automobiles or private walking about town and the like, things that we typically take for granted these days. However, precision timekeeping has been one of those things that has led to advances in behavioral sciences as well. So for example, the invention of the stopwatch, the tachistoscope and the like have allowed us to advance the science of neurology and neuropsychology in studying human perception. Of course, in the behavioral aspects, the work of B.F. Skinner's, which has been focused on variable and fixed interval ratio schedules of reinforcement, measurement of response latencies and the like, have all really owed a lot to the establishment of precise time bases. So one of the things about having a really good estimate of exactly what time it is and the like has been the development of indoor GPS. I'm going to bypass showing you a short video here because we just saw one in the interest of time. But the creation of ultra-wideband real-time location systems permits actually doing GPS indoors, and with an accuracy not of, say, 3 meters, but about 20 centimeters. So using small transponder devices, which measure only about 2.5 centimeters on the side and maybe about a centimeter thick, I could give you the location of virtually every person in this room as often as 100 times per second, and who's sitting next to who and for how long. So you can get extraordinarily accurate data and positioning information from this system, which was originally developed through the military for the purposes of tracking its inventory within container ships. The original work was done around about the early 1990s, around about the time of Desert Storm. The military needed a way to determine whether or not a particular container containing a Humvee was located in one particular spot of the hold of a ship or another. So a system like this had to, of course, be immune from radio interference and provide exacting precision on location. And so the ultra-wideband real-time system actually uses a combination of angle of arrival and time delay of arrival information in order to resolve very high degrees of accuracy, and does so with a tag that consumes power at the level of about, a single battery will go for about 3 months, to give you some idea. So I always love this quote from Abraham Maslow, which is basically kind of sums up the potentialities, shall we say, to treat everything as if it was a nail, if the only thing you know how to use is a hammer. It's important to realize that, simply because you're raised using time as your principal measure, that there are other ways to do things. And so we're going to introduce now space as the alternative to doing everything with a stopwatch or a timing instrument. So why did we wind up using real-time location systems to begin with in our work? Well, it goes back to a study of wandering behavior in people with dementia. Donna Algaze, who's a good close friend of mine and colleague, had developed the Algaze wandering scale for the studying of wandering of people with dementia in assisted living facilities. She found that you could train observers with a clipboard to sit in a facility and measure direct travel, which was fairly easy to discern. You could tell when a person was walking reasonably straight. Lapping back and forth, as well as pacing, could actually be discerned by a human observer pretty well. What was a real problem, however, was measuring random movement. And unfortunately, random movement happened to be one of the things that people with dementia did a lot of. So the way they originally did it was you'd measure all of the things that you could quantify, all the direct incidents and all of the lapping and all of the pacing and so forth. Sum all that up, subtract it from the grand total, and whatever was left over was random. Well, that wasn't a very good way to do it. And so we felt that we needed something better. Part of the other problem is you take a person with a clipboard and you set them in an assisted living facility, and what's the first thing that happens is you set them down, and the little old lady comes over and says, "Oh, you're new here, aren't you? Let me tell you about my grandchildren," and sits down. And so you have a nice reactive measure there. You have unfortunately something that's changing the behavior of your subject. So it sort of makes it difficult in order to get really good estimates. So we wanted to have something that would remain on station all the time and would gather information in the background. And this is what we came up with. The Ubisense company down in Cambridge made this little transponder, as you can see here. Again, this is the one that we were talking about. and it can provide very high update rates. As a matter of fact, this slide is somewhat dated. It indicates location update rates of around 2 hertz. It's actually up to 100 times per second and even higher than that now. And as a result, they've actually got the accuracy of it down quite a bit better. Each of those tags, though, is what we would call an asset tag. These are to be put on physical assets that you want to track, like, for example, an infusion pump in a hospital and the like, if you want to know exactly where it is. Because a lot of hospitals now are trying to improve their efficiency by tracking the equipment and the like. We adapted it for use for people by adding a small band to it. And the band we chose happened to be made by a Canadian company called Silverfoot, which makes ladies' ankle bracelets. So we realized that we were going to be working with predominantly women in the assisted living facility. So we wanted them to have a choice of very attractive bands that they could use with a tag as a way to help facilitate acceptance of the technology. And behold, in the studies that we ran, at the end of the studies, we actually had a number of subjects come to us and say, we want to keep it. We like the band. It's pretty. It's So we took the band off and took the tag and gave them the band and let them keep that. So our initial tests of the technology were published in the journal Geron Technology with Donna Algaze, looking at the possibilities of actually using this technology for studying wandering behavior in dementia. But there was still one big problem, which was simply because we could see the tracking data and producing the drunkard's walk, so to speak. We needed some way to quantify this. And for that, we turned actually to animal ecology studies. Now, it's sort of an interesting sort of backdoor into this, because at that time, one of my colleagues, Jeffrey Craighead, was doing work on studying the behavior of robot drivers and looking at this for his doctoral dissertation. And he had realized that he needed a way to quantify errors in movement and estimation, and was working with fractal dimension. And he introduced me to the work of Willis Nams, who is an animal ecologist at Dalhousie University in Canada. And Willis had been using fractal dimension with GPS on radio tagging collars and animals in the wild to study how animals utilize the space. So when you take an animal and you put them into a brand new area, the first thing that they do is they go and build a map, if you will, of the area. They wander around in it in order to acquire information about where the resources are. Where's shelter, where's food, where's water, where's access to mates, and this sort of thing. And as they build a map, they do progressively less of the wandering, and they start going directly to the individual spaces where the resources are. Okay, so far so good. That kind of movement, if you will, that exploratory movement, tends to look a lot like what we would call here a drunkard's walk. Okay? Now, it turns out fractal dimension actually has a very interesting property to it. It has a lower bound of 1.0, which means you need a single dimension to describe a line, basically length. So you have a starting point and an end point. In nature, you almost never see a perfectly straight line being generated by an animal. They come close, but not really following a straight line. However, the opposite end of it is complete random chaos. It's, if you will, a Brownian motion scenario, complete randomness. So all walks can be quantified as falling somewhere between a perfectly straight walk and ones that are just so chaotic that they need all of a second dimension, hence the value of 2, to describe them. So we'll give you an example here of the drunkard's walk in real time.
In Ohio, a state trooper is trying to stop a suspected female DUI in this SUV. Motorists suspected of driving under the influence, DUI, are routinely asked by police officers to perform one or more field sobriety exercises. The woman aroused suspicion when her car was seen veering all over the highway. It seems like this woman has no idea that the patrol officer has been following her for quite some time.
How much you had to drink? Not at all? All right. Yes, your insurance card with you?
Yes, I do.
With the woman's vehicle finally stationary, the officer wants to begin with the sobriety test. But before he can, the woman decides that she needs to retie her shoelaces.
Whoa, 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 don't fall over on me.
The officer finally starts his test, beginning with something easy. He asks her to walk in a straight
Stand just
line.
like that. Keep your arms down at your side. What I want you to do is take 9 heel-to-toe steps, just like this. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9. Stand that. When you're ready to begin, go ahead and begin.
Operating a vehicle under the influence of alcohol.
Under arrest.
So in this case, you saw an individual clearly veering from side to side, actually carrying on the drunkard's walk. And he also saw a fall associated with that, which could have easily led to a TBI if she had landed full force on her forehead. So you've sort of seen the worst of all possible worlds in one combination of a case of chemically induced high fractal D. So as I mentioned, NAMS and Associates have a free fractal D calculation program, which is available on his website at Dalhousie, for those of you who may be interested in following up on this by doing some of your own work using some of the conveniently available GPS units that are available now for logging and tracking individuals out in the real world. And it does work with GPS on humans. I hired Jeff Craighead after he graduated to write a real-time fractal path analysis program, which would actually take the data from the ultra-wideband real-time system while the people were walking, and for each person in the assisted living facility, calculate a fractal dimension number for every path that every person walked. So we were getting data from, say, 53 people simultaneously being written into the database for every time that they generated a path. So you could get some really stable daily estimates. And we published these informations in Jeff Craighead's publication on using the fractal dimension to assess robot operator skills. And of course, Phyllis Nams's program is available online. So we started looking at the clinical measures that were available from these individuals in the assisted living facility that we were recording data from. We recorded a month's worth of fractal dimension data from their movements, just normal walking during the day, and we evaluated the fractal D values against the mini-mental state exam. Mini-mental state being a very commonly used test developed years ago for the evaluation of older adults' cognition. And one of the things that we found was that we had generally a correlation of minus 0.47, which was significant. We published this in Gerontechnology and elsewhere, and also in Methods of Information in Medicine. But we found out in a subsequent study that it was entirely due to the geographic orientation items within the MMSE, which are, interestingly enough, what city are we in, what state are we in, what's the street address of this place. These all basically oriented toward spatial orientation. If they couldn't tell you where they were, they walked like drunks, which is very interesting. Okay, so there was a lot of confusion, spatial confusion that was going on there. We also found out that fractal dimension did a pretty good job of differentiating which individuals had dementia from those that did not. And also, and this is more important, in 2012, we ran a one-year-long study where we collected fractal D over a period, over that period, on 53 people. We looked at the fall data for each of these people, And then since we had the time and dates that the falls occurred, we were able to subcategorize the falls into those that did not involve just a simple slip out of a chair. The individual fell asleep and slid to the floor. That's classified as a fall. But we differentiated them on the basis of whether or not the person was up walking around. For those falls, fractal D was higher in the week prior to the fall. So we're thinking, oh, okay, now maybe this is related to what we just saw with the drunkard's walk with the drunken lady falling down. Maybe there's an association here. Maybe that spatial confusion is putting people more at risk. And one of the things that we did find with that data was that if we went back 2 weeks, that the association became weaker. So it seemed like there was a decay curve the further back in time you went. So maybe what we can do is we can pull out that kind of movement variability data and develop sort of an early warning system for people in assisted living facilities, managers, to specifically focus on an individual who might be showing elevated fractal dimension and find out why. Are there problems with the individual's health? Are they not sleeping well? Are they not eating? Are there urinary tract infections? Are there other things that are affecting their cognition that might be putting them at an elevated risk for falls that we could do something about, and then maybe use the fractal D values to show that we're actually addressing what the problem is. The fractal D starts coming down afterwards. Maybe you found what it is that was keeping it up in the first place. So it may prove to be a fairly good tool in that way, not only a diagnostic, but also one to tell you when you're doing something good. So I'm just going to show you here 2 individuals. These are movement paths from 2 women taken during the same 2-hour block on the same day in the same space. The 4 red dots are the 4 UBsense sensors. Each of those points constitutes a data point measured in time. Now, which one of those do you think has dementia? Well, it's the one on the bottom. Okay. So the fractal dimension value for the one on the top is a value of about 1.2, which is generally what we see in normal people. And not surprisingly, their MMSE is a 25, which is not remarkable. The MMSE for the individual in the lower frame was 21, and their fractal dimension values was 1.4. Generally, when we start seeing numbers that are higher than about 1.27, we start getting concerned. So we've actually had enough time to calculate norms for individuals. Now we're going to branch into the next phase of the research. One of the individuals working with me during my early studies with dementia was a fellow by the name of Jan Jazowitz, who worked for the Veterans Administration, who did the standardized gait and balance assessment on the 53 individuals we followed for a period of a year. Jan had a very kind of interesting idea that we could use the tracking data to not only calculate fractal dimension, but also use it to study the recovery process in people with TBI and help provide location-based prompts and health services delivery at point of care. Now, in the James A. Haley Veterans Administration Hospital, there is a facility which takes care of about 10 patients simultaneously for periods of upwards of 6 months to a year. What you're looking at here is the floor plan for that facility. It gives you some information here about the waiting room where people enter. There's an activities, a daily living room here. These are individual dorm rooms along the side. And these are all of the clinical offices where individuals get treated during the process of their stay. Plus, they will come and go from the facility out into the main hospital for treatment as needed. These are individuals who, in some cases, are active duty military personnel who have received a concussion or an invasive head wound in the process of the duties that they've been carrying out either in Iraq or Afghanistan. But they can also be American citizens who are veterans who decided to go for a joyride on their motorcycle without a helmet. So One of the problems, of course, with riding a vehicle without a helmet is that sometimes you encounter things on the road you hadn't planned on it, and you hit the road and smack your forehead. And in that case, you're generally doing damage to the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are involved, of course, in the planning and execution of movement and future plans just in general. So one of the things that happens with TBI damage to the frontal lobes is people don't do a very good job planning out or remembering to take medications and do other activities that are critical to the recovery. So having prompting is an important thing, and being able to deliver prompts on specific times and schedules, and also locations. Within the floor plan you see here, instead of those 4 sensors we had earlier, we have 188 inside this facility. This provides us with accuracies down to about 20 centimeters inside the facility, but there are also about 35 different wall-mounted TV panels. Each of those panels is linked into a computer system through a network which will deliver prompts to the person nearest to them, contingent upon the time in their schedule when they're supposed to be doing something like taking medication, and their identity. So it can differentiate, say, me from anyone else in the room, knows that I'm standing next to the panel that says, you know, Bill, you have an appointment to see physical therapy in room 108 in 5 minutes. That's the level of granularity. Plus, it also collects fractal dimension data in the background. So with a tip of the hat, I'd like to say, of course, welcome to, or I should say thank you to Stephen Scott, who is Doctor of Osteopathy and Chief of Physical Medicine Rehab Services at James A. Haley, who made this all possible. Steve is our leader of our program. So let's consider some of the things that we're doing with this smart data that we're gathering in addition to collecting fractal dimension. We're detecting the presence of individuals in dangerous areas, signaling caregivers when individuals wander away or get out of the facility. That can be a real problem for people with TBI because, like people with dementia, they wander away sometimes and they can get lost in the community. And we have some very busy highways right next to the James A. Haley Hospital that can kill them. People wander out into the street. But we can also provide task reminders, provide instructions for activities of daily living, like how to make a sandwich, how to do different activities, provide cues that it's time to go for a treatment, and so forth. And also, we can, of course, generate reports and analytics from the data as to how a person is progressing with their treatment. So these are just some of the sources of data. Of course, I mentioned the ultra-wideband real-time location system data that we have coming into the system, but we also have other sensors. We have moisture sensors, we have motion sensors and the like, but we also have data from external devices that are being worn by the individuals, as well as some manual data entry, such as the schedules for medication that the individual needs to adhere to. And then, of course, these are some of the types of outputs that we can get from the automated system in terms of data on web pages that can be reviewed by caregivers, or carers as you call them here, text and email prompts which can then go to iPhones and other devices like this that the individual carries on their person. Okay. So I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because they're generally, these are just some of the different categories that show up in the reports, like room and area activity, basically how much time is the individual up moving around during the day. One of the problems, of course, in rehabilitation is making sure that an individual gets enough exercise. Within the VA, they run into a problem routinely with individuals remaining in bed, just not getting enough physical exercise. So this adversely affects their exercise and the recovery. Social interactions, because we're using a real-time location system, like right in the middle of a week, they're going to alter the dose or type of medication the person might be getting. This is a way of showing for us when the individual took the medication and whether they successfully did it on their own. For the most part, we're looking at people who, within our polytrauma center, are being asked to take medication and who go to the nurse's station in order to be observed taking the medication. Most of these people can't take medication on their own initially. The goal is to get them to the point where they can, and that's part of the strategy for releasing them. Of course, as I mentioned, we have water sensors. We basically tell whether or not a shower has been turned on. So this basic hygiene for activities of daily living. The exit from the residence. So the individual, say, may leave our building, go out into the community, but we keep a record of where they were going and when they expect to come back. And then we look at the degree to which it matches up with what they actually said they were going to do. In addition, we have direct measures of physical exercise, whether or not the individual was in the gym, were they on the treadmill machine, and for how long a period of time. Again, these are all data that the clinicians are using in order to compile a profile of their data and recovery. Total movement, again, first and last time that the tag moved during the day, total physical distance that the individual was moving, etc. We also have messages, information that comes from the calendaring program, also text messages and the like, prompts from the system. You need to take your medication. You need to engage in, say, this particular activity at this particular time, at this particular location. Number of appointments the individual kept during the week. Did they go to the medication group or occupational therapy? Did they show up? Were they on time? Timeliness is one of those things that we don't think too much about until it becomes a real problem for other people. Like, for example, when we first put the system in, one of the things that the clinicians told us right away was how much they appreciated the fact that they could locate a patient who didn't show up for physical therapy or for group therapy. So if you've got a group therapy session where you've got 9 people in it and you're missing one guy, well, you've got to go find that guy. And in the first case, before we put the system in, they were taking like 20 minutes to go scour that whole facility, which is like a rabbit warren, trying to find the one guy who's missing. Well, we were able to reduce that down to just a few minutes. They can go to the nearest screen, say, oh, well, he's in room 104A, walk over there, grab him, bring him back, and start your therapy session. So they were able to see, economies there in terms of time saving as far as the delivery of therapy and the like. Of course, basic to-do lists, things that a person might not have to be reminded of who was cognitively normal, might become a real problem. Like, for example, clean the pool, take the garbage out, study letters, these sorts of things. Find pictures of trees, who knows, whatever the tasks might be, but these might serve as basic reminders for activities that they might have trouble initiating otherwise. And then we also have raw data that we can gather directly from the sensors. So the ones that you saw previously were kind of distilled inputs where we've managed to link the sensor data against some conceptual measure that we're interested in grabbing. In this case, we can look at the raw sensor data and combine it in other ways. So we're not hidebound to using a sensor for water in one particular way or another. So this just gives you some idea of what we might be able to get. For example, like data from a medication box as to whether or not it was opened or not, or whether or not a shower was used, or a particular door was open, or a fan. It's all very granular, but it can be combined in ways that can be very useful. And of course, fractal dimension numbers. So we can get data directly from an individual over periods of days. We can also generate from this, of course, weekly reports on a number of different measures, so that if we're interested as a clinician from following how well a person is doing across time on their medication compliance, on showing up for meetings, etc., their fractal dimension numbers, we can gather that information and look at it over time. This is just an example of what the client sees in terms of their typical daily activities. But one of the things that we wanted to also show in this with the real-time location system was information about not only just simple data about fractal dimension, but also information about the individual's speed, vector information, and so forth. Because clinicians, let's face it, they're very familiar with measures of walking speed and the like. And for them, the tracking data has particular relevance when you begin looking at measures with which they are customarily familiar. So fractal dimension is relatively something new, but we were very interested, of course, in whether or not we could kind of get the clinicians to start embracing this as a measure. So we started looking at the data that was being collected behind the scenes, I almost said screens, which is true also, but in terms of the movement variability of these 10 patients over time. And so we followed the data of 22 individuals. And it was rather interesting. What we found was that of the 22 individuals who we followed for 4 months or greater, we found that you could plot a trend line through their data and differentiate these individuals into 2 groups. It was a post hoc analysis. It was not random assignment, but it did bear out some fairly interesting results in this. For the 10 individuals who showed that their fractal dimension went down, they actually had better clinical outcomes on the Mayo-Portland Adaptability Index, which is their clinical measure, which is used in the Polytrauma Center. Whereas those for whom the fractal D did not go down were worse. This is an example of one individual who was followed for a period of, this was November 3rd, 2011, through April the 4th, 2012. Each of those data points represents the mean for the day for that individual. And as you can see, they're coming in with a fractal dimension during the first couple of weeks that is running around about 150 or thereabouts, which is pretty high. Normal, as I mentioned, is about 1.27, so to give you some idea of the kind of variability that we see from one day to the next. So this is an individual who clearly went down over that period of time. This is another individual who came in with values actually fairly similar to the first from, let's see, what was it, January 13th, 2012 through July the 8th of 2012. Actually, the overall means are fairly similar, but there was no trend in this individual's data toward a decline. One of the things that seemed to be the case, although I don't really have the full empirical backing yet to make this assertion, but it seems to be the case that once the value is very high, at least initially, that you don't tend to see a lot of improvement. That, basically once they're damaged beyond a particular point, they don't come down. Now, one of the things about this that makes it significant for traumatic brain injury is the fact that there really aren't a lot of good biometrics for TBI and TBI recovery. There just aren't. The measures out there, like the Mayo-Portland Adaptability Index, require a team of clinicians to actually put down their impressions of the improvement of the individual, but they also collect data from the caregivers, and they also collect data in an independent assessment from the care recipient themselves. So they try to triangulate between these, and these things take many hours in order to complete. And they're usually only done twice. Once when you come in so that you get a basic assessment of how bad the damage is, and once when the clinicians have reached a determination that it's time to release them. So let's redo this process again. But it's a very expensive and time-consuming test in order to give. So having anything that you could gather from just simple movement data could be very useful. Now this data is one that is really kind of exciting. What you're looking at here as the likelihood that an individual is going to do what the prompt tells them to do, measured as a function of their fractal dimension numbers taken just off a GPS that we had them wear when they went and walked around outside prior to their 4 or 5 months of recovery. So in other words, the probability of the behavior actually being done was the accumulated total likelihood that you would actually do what each of the prompts given to you over the next 6 months told you to do. So we had indices, if you will, of whether or not the actual behavior was carried out. So one of the things that should be pretty clear out of this is that the higher your fractal dimension numbers, the less likely you are to do what it is that I tell you to do. Which means that if you have more spatial confusion and the like, you're going to probably ignore the prompt. You're not going to do an awful lot of what it is that I tell you to do. And that may be important for the design of new technologies to help facilitate behavior by prompting. Because right now, it's kind of a one-size-fits-all. We just assume you give somebody a prompt, they're going to do it. But if you can get that information from, say, the GPS unit on the phone that the person's carrying with them, you might choose a different type of prompt or a different mechanism to interact with them on that particular day. So one of the things also, it's a potential policy implication, might be the use of fractal dimension to help determine whether or not a person's really capable of living alone or independently. Which is fairly significant because right now it's done pretty much by the estimation of what the clinician thinks is the best for the patient. So this might be able to serve as an additional piece of information to be used when making that determination. So we've also been working to deploy this technology at home. This has been done in individuals' homes. We've actually been moving more toward a fairly simplified version, only using the real-time location system in very explicit cases because it's fairly expensive. The real-time location data actually scales pretty well when you can get a lot of people together in one small place, and you can put in this fairly expensive system and do recording over extended intervals of time. Not so much when you're trying to put it into an individual's home. There's a lot cheaper ways to do it. Now, this is one that I love to show people because this is one of these things that, it's sort of like you just happen to have the camera going at the right time when the animal does that one thing that you've sort of always suspected that maybe they could do, but nobody in the world's ever seen them to actually do it. But nature shows you something that you hadn't expected to see. Okay, this is our subject PL. He came in, these individual data points are means. That value that you see on the horizontal bar is the mean level, which we would consider to be indicative of a cognitively normal person, about a 1.27. So it's just for illustration purposes. He came in with values somewhere between 1.27 and 1.3. So cognitively right about where we would consider him to be normal. Now, at this vertical bar that you see here, he had surgery. They took him out and they put a plastic plate in his head. Okay. Then he had a period of recovery and they returned him to the polytrauma center. And you can see his values started going up. Now, at this point, the clinicians, and let me remind you, nobody had seen any of this data. This is all a post hoc analysis, so nobody made any determinations at that point. At this point, the clinicians gave him a cane because they were afraid he was going to fall. Okay, so they independently determined that he was unstable. And then, for the next several weeks, he continued to use the cane as he was walking about the facility. And right about here, the clinicians said, well, you know, he's recovered enough, we'll take the cane away. And then finally, when he reached this point over here, they said, well, he's recovered well enough, we'll send him home. Okay, so they made a determination to send him back home about the same point as where we consider to be cognitively normal, around about 1.27, which I found was fairly interesting only because we've seen that happen again and again in the cases when individuals have recovered sufficiently that the clinicians were satisfied that they could go home and live independently. So in this case, what you really are seeing here is the effect of the surgical intervention on this individual and what it's done to their movement variability and to their stability, again, independently assessed by clinicians. So it's pretty cool because it's a kind of a natural experiment, if you will. So just to conclude, looks like I'm just about ready, run out of time, that tracking using these kinds of technologies, using fractal dimension as a metric, can yield very important insights into recovery from traumatic brain injury and potentially help us get a better understanding of phenomenon such as wandering. That movement data has a story all its own to tell that you would never see if what you were looking at was speed of travel, for example, or reaction time or temporal measures. And when you start looking at the spatial measures for their own worth, they have their own very, very important story to tell you. So thank you very much.